The bull was injured and near death, until a father fought to save it for his son. The bull lay in the dirt, half buried under dry branches and dead leaves, its chest rising and falling in shallow, rattling breaths. Mason Thorne spotted it while checking the far edge of his property, a stretch of scrubland no good for farming and rarely visited. At first, he thought it was a pile of black tarps caught in the bramble, but when he stepped closer and the thing groaned, a deep, guttural sound of pain and exhaustion, he froze. It was massive. Its ribs stuck out like ladder rungs under its hide, and its back leg was bent in a way that made Mason's stomach tighten. Deep cuts lined its side, the kind not made by barbed wire or branches. These were curved, deliberate. Scars from something brutal. He stepped cautiously, one boot crunching twigs underfoot, his hand resting near the knife on his belt. The bull's eyes were cracked open, dull but alert. It didn't try to rise. It just watched him, too broken to move, but not dead enough to give up. Mason knelt slowly. He wasn't one to get sentimental about animals, especially not half-dead ones dumped on his land. He'd seen injuries like these before, back when illegal fighting rings were whispered about down by the canyon roads. Unlicensed, underground, and cruel. He remembered the talk at McCready's feed store about one such ring going dark after a raid months ago. Maybe this one got out before the place was torched, or maybe it was dumped when it lost. Either way, Mason's first thought was simple and cold. "I'll have to put it down." He muttered it under his breath, already reaching back to unhook the small rifle from the ATV strapped behind him. Mercy. That was all he could offer. The last thing this beast needed was another day of slow dying in the sun. "Don't." The voice was small, cracked by wind and dust. Mason turned. Caleb stood about 15 yards away, hands balled into fists at his sides, eyes wide. The boy's hair was tousled, his face pinched with worry, and he looked thinner than Mason remembered from just last week. He must have followed him from the house. The kid barely spoke since his mother died. Now he was talking. To protect this. Mason lowered the rifle, his brow knitting. "Caleb, it's not going to make it. Look at it." But Caleb didn't move. He stepped forward slowly, cautiously, like approaching a wounded friend. He crouched next to the bull and placed his hand gently on its forehead. Mason tensed, but the bull didn't react. It just let the boy touch it. "He's not just some animal," Caleb said softly, not looking away. "He's trying to stay alive." The wind picked up across the ridge, tossing dust between them. Mason stared at his son. There was something in the boy's voice, quiet, but firm, and something in his eyes Mason hadn't seen in months. Focus, purpose. It was madness. But still, Mason found himself strapping a makeshift ramp onto the trailer, and together, they heaved the broken animal into the back. It moaned once but didn't resist. The ride home was slow, the shocks groaning under the weight. Mason kept glancing at his son, who sat beside the bull, whispering to it like he was reading it a bedtime story. Dr. Sim, the local vet, was waiting by the barn an hour later. He took one look at the bull, sucked air through his teeth, and shook his head. "Thorne, you're wasting your time. This animal won't see next week. It's got nerve damage, rot starting in the leg, and signs of malnutrition so bad it probably can't stand." "I know," Mason replied. "You still want me to try?" "I want you to patch it up as best you can." Dr. Sim gave a tired sigh and went to work. The first 2 days were rough. The bull didn't move. It barely drank the water Mason left. But Caleb was there constantly, stroking its hide, changing its bandages, speaking to it like it was listening. By the third day, Titan, Caleb named it Titan after one of the old storybooks, lifted its head when the boy entered. On the fourth, it tried to stand. Mason watched from the doorway, arms crossed, not sure what surprised him more, the bull's strength or his son's. It was like something had cracked open in Caleb. He wasn't silent anymore. He didn't wake up screaming from dreams. He didn't drift through the house like a ghost. He was alive again, because of that bull. But good things never lasted long in Westward Ridge. By the end of the first week, word had gotten out. First, it was just a passing comment at the feed store. Then someone asked Mason if the rumors were true, that he was keeping a stolen bull. Mason laughed it off. But 2 days later, his neighbor Bartley stopped him while he was unloading feed. "That bull got scars, don't it?" Bartley asked, spitting dust. Maybe. Why? He looks like one of Everett Shaw's fighters. You know the kind. Mason said nothing. He just carried the feed inside. That night, a truck pulled into the yard, big, black, and quiet. Mason stepped out with his rifle slung low. The door opened, and a man climbed out. Everett Shaw was a broad-shouldered brute in his 50s, with slicked-back hair and a jaw that looked carved from iron. He didn't smile, just looked at Mason like the land beneath him was already sold. "You've got something of mine," he said. Mason said nothing. A bull, black coat, left hind twisted. Answers to the name Chaos Mason raised a brow. He doesn't answer to anything. He barely walks. Shaw stepped closer, the weight of his boots heavy in the gravel. "That animal was stolen from my facility 3 weeks ago. I don't care how he got here, but I want him back. Don't think I can help you." "I wasn't asking." Mason's grip on the rifle tightened. "You run a fighting ring, Everett. That's illegal. Don't act like you've got morals now, Thorne. You think they'll believe you over me? I own half this county." "I don't care who you own," Mason said quietly. Shaw stared at him for a long moment. "You've got 1 week to return what's mine. After that," he glanced toward the barn, "I'll come back, and next time I won't ask nicely." He left in a cloud of dust. Mason stood still long after the truck vanished. That night, he locked every barn door and loaded 5 shells into his shotgun. He didn't tell Caleb about the visit. The boy was busy making a soft blanket for Titan's stall and humming to himself as he worked. Mason sat on the porch watching the stars, feeling something stir in his chest. He didn't know what Titan was or where it had come from, but he knew one thing for certain. It had brought his son back from a darkness no medicine could touch. He wasn't going to let Everett take that away. Caleb didn't know about the threat, but Mason did, and he wasn't about to let the only thing his son had left be taken from him. The fence line had been cut. Mason spotted it just after sunrise when he was making his usual sweep of the eastern ridge. The wire hung in a slack curve between 2 posts, snipped clean through, not torn by an animal, not loosened by wind, cut with precision. His hand moved automatically to the shotgun slung across his back. The morning was quiet, too quiet, and every crunch of dry grass beneath his boot sent a tremor down his spine. He scanned the brush for movement, but there was nothing. Just the sound of wind dragging through brittle leaves. He reached the damaged section and knelt, inspecting the marks. Whoever had done it hadn't bothered to cover their tracks. The faint impressions of boot soles led toward the ravine on the edge of the property, just far enough to suggest a quick escape, just clear enough to send a message. He stood slowly, jaw tight, breath fogging in the cold morning air. Everett had started early. Mason worked through the rest of the morning with grim determination. He reinforced the broken fence, welding a length of iron crossbeam behind it. Then he walked the perimeter again, checking every inch of wire and board, every bolt and hinge. At the barn, he climbed up to the roof and added a second lock to the side hatch. By midday, his hands were blistered, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat. But he didn't stop. In the barn below, Caleb was sitting cross-legged in the straw, spooning crushed oats and water into a bucket, whispering softly as he nudged it toward Titan. The bull stirred, eyes heavy but alert, ears twitching toward the boy's voice. When Caleb reached out, Titan leaned into the touch, letting out a slow, rumbling breath. Mason watched them from the doorway, arms folded, chest tight. The connection between them was unshakable now, strange, unspoken, and deeper than Mason understood. It was as if they shared a wound the rest of the world couldn't see. "I think he knows I'm trying to help," Caleb said quietly, not looking back. "He knows," Mason replied, voice hoarse. "That's what makes him different." That night, Mason opened the old tool chest in the shed behind the house. Buried beneath rusted shears and forgotten engine parts, wrapped in oilcloth, was his grandfather's rifle. He remembered it from when he was a boy, the heavy feel of it, the smell of old metal, the way his grandfather's hands never trembled when he carried it. Mason cleaned the barrel, checked the action, and set it by the kitchen door. He didn't tell Caleb. Some truths weren't for children to carry. By the third night, the stars were hidden behind a blanket of thick clouds, and the air was too still. Titan had taken to standing, shaky but upright, every time Caleb entered the barn. He followed the boy's movement with uncanny precision, even turning toward the stall door before it opened. Mason noticed. More than once he saw the bull react before a sound was made, ears twitching toward footsteps, muscles tensing at approaching voices. "You see that?" Mason asked once, crouching beside the hay. Caleb looked up, brushing straw from his shirt. "He's always listening." Mason nodded, unsettled. "He's not just listening, he knows." Caleb smiled, but his voice was quiet when he answered. "He remembers." Later that night, long after Caleb had gone to bed, Mason sat on the porch, watching the barn in the distance. The floodlight they'd rigged onto the roof cast long shadows across the yard. He was about to go inside when something moved near the tree line, fast, low. He was on his feet instantly, grabbing the rifle. By the time he reached the barn, the shadows had vanished. The stall was untouched, but there, nailed into the wooden post beside the door, was a folded scrap of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled it free. "Last warning." The words were printed in blocky, deliberate strokes. No signature, no name. But Mason didn't need one. He crumpled the paper and shoved it into his coat. The next morning, Mason drove into town to speak with Sheriff Dalton. The office door was unlocked, but the sheriff wasn't inside. A teenage deputy named Cody sat behind the front desk, nervously tapping at a keyboard. "Where's Dalton?" Mason asked, keeping his voice steady. He's out on a call," Cody said quickly, avoiding eye contact. "It's important. I can tell him you stopped by. I need him to know Everett Shaw threatened my property, that he's sending people at night." Cody swallowed. I'll let him know." Mason stared at him for a long moment, watching the fear flicker behind his eyes. The kid wasn't lying. He was scared. Of Everett. Of what he represented. Back at the farm, Caleb was waiting in the barn with a strange expression on his face. "Dad," he said, eyes bright with wonder. "Titan walked." Mason blinked. "Walked?" "Not just stood up. He walked. Across the whole stall." They both turned as the bull shifted in the straw, pushing up to its feet with deliberate effort. The leg that had once hung limp now pressed firm into the ground. It was slow, yes, but steady. More than that, Titan didn't limp. He walked like he meant to, like he chose to. "Look at him," Caleb whispered. "He's healing." Mason nodded slowly, though something cold pressed against the back of his neck. That evening he decided not to lock the barn. Instead, he slept in a chair by the window, rifle across his lap. Around 2 a.m, the scent of smoke slipped under the door. He bolted upright. The hay barn, separate from the livestock barn, was burning. Flames licked through the dry roof, cracking wood and sending sparks into the sky. Mason ran toward it, dragging the hose behind him, feet pounding through dirt and ash. He worked quickly, spraying water against the edges, stamping out flare-ups with his boots, coughing through the smoke. By the time the fire was under control, most of the feed had been reduced to blackened piles. The barn itself stood, but barely. He stood panting in the yard, chest heaving, hands trembling. That was no accident. That was war. Caleb appeared at the edge of the house, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes wide with fear. "Are you okay?" he called out. "I'm fine," Mason lied. They walked back to the barn in silence. Inside, Titan stood alert, his massive head lifted, nostrils flaring. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't flinched. He had waited, like he'd known. As Mason closed the door, Caleb turned to him. His face was pale, but his voice didn't shake. "Dad, what if they come back?" Mason looked at him, unsure how much to say. "I'll be ready," he said. But Caleb stepped forward and placed a hand on Titan's side. The bull didn't move. "Let him be ready," Caleb said. "You don't have to fight alone." Mason's mouth opened, but no words came. "He's not just a bull," Caleb whispered. "He remembers who hurt him." And for the first time, Mason didn't know what scared him more, Everett's crew, or the fact that maybe, somehow, his son was right. Lightning cracked above the ridge like a whip, splitting the sky in jagged white lines as the storm rolled in heavy and loud. Rain hadn't touched Westward Ridge in weeks, but now it came with fury, soaking the dry ground in sheets. Thunder shook the porch boards beneath Mason's boots, and every gust of wind rattled the barn doors like they were being pushed from the inside. Mason stood in the center of his yard, his coat clinging to his back, the rifle firm in his hands. His jaw was locked tight. The headlights came into view first, 2 trucks crawling up the muddy path that led to his land, their tires sliding just enough to throw sparks of dirt with every turn. As they neared, Mason could make out the figures riding in the back. 5 men, all heavyset and soaked through, their postures casual, but their eyes sharp. And then, stepping out from the passenger side of the lead truck, Everett Shaw. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a tan duster that whipped violently in the wind, and though the rain streaked down his face, his expression didn't flinch. Cold, focused, determined. Mason met him at the edge of the gravel drive, the rifle held low but visible. "You're trespassing," Mason said, the wind nearly swallowing his words. Everett didn't blink. "I'm here with legal authority." The door to the second truck opened, and a tall, narrow-faced man climbed out holding a folded packet of papers in a plastic sleeve. He wore a worn jacket with a veterinary patch on the arm, but the badge looked flimsy, more prop than proof. "This here is Dr. Penrose," Everett said. "He's come to collect stolen property." Mason didn't move. "You bring forged papers and a fake vet in a storm, and you expect me to hand over my son's bull?" Everett's face twisted just slightly. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Thorne." The rain beat down harder, drumming against the metal roof of the barn like a warning. "I know what this is," Mason said, his voice harder now. "You want him back to keep your ring quiet. But this isn't a ring. This is my land. That bull stays." Behind them, one of Everett's men started circling toward the barn. Mason took 1 step sideways and raised the rifle, just enough to make his point. The man froze. Then the barn doors burst open, not from the outside, from within. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the yard. The heavy beam Mason had locked in place days ago was shoved aside like driftwood. Titan stepped out, rain soaking his black hide, his muscles gleaming under flashes of lightning. He didn't limp. He didn't hesitate. His eyes locked onto Everett's men with quiet, terrifying focus. The 5 men stepped back. "What in—" one of them muttered, already retreating. Titan moved. He didn't charge wildly. He picked his target and struck like he'd done it 100 times before. The first man flew backward, landing flat on his back with a thud that echoed even under thunder. The second barely raised his arm before Titan's head slammed into his chest, sending him crashing through a pile of fencing. Shouts filled the air. One man scrambled into the truck bed. Another tried drawing a weapon but dropped it when Titan spun, his hooves carving deep into the mud. The truck's front grille caved inward as Titan struck it head-on. The horn sputtered and died. Everett took a step back, lips parted, rain streaking down his cheeks like sweat. "What is that thing?" he whispered. Mason didn't answer. Titan turned then, eyes still glowing with something more than rage, more than instinct. He paused, breath steaming in the storm. From the porch, Caleb's voice rose like a spark in the chaos. "Stop!" Titan froze, not slowed, not stumbled, stopped. Every muscle in the bull's body locked in place. He stood still, chest rising and falling, rain sliding down his shoulders in rivulets. His head lowered slowly, eyes no longer focused on the men but on Caleb, who stood barefoot in the mud, hands clenched at his sides. Mason's breath caught. The air around them buzzed, not from lightning, but from disbelief. Titan didn't move again. One of Everett's men moaned on the ground, clutching his ribs. Another limped away, helped by the one who hadn't been knocked down. Sheriff Dalton's cruiser finally crested the ridge, headlights sweeping across the carnage. Mason half expected him to drive right past, like he had so many times before, but the car stopped. And from the passenger side stepped someone Mason didn't recognize. A tall man in a dark gray suit, his shoes already muddy, his expression unreadable. He walked with purpose, ignoring the broken fencing, the smoking truck, and the standoff of soaked men. His badge glinted under the porch light as he approached. "Name's Ford," he said quietly to Mason. "State Agriculture Bureau." Mason narrowed his eyes. "I didn't call you." "No," Ford replied. but someone in New Altair did. Said a man named Thorne had a bull with marks from an outlawed fighting ring. Said you wouldn't give it up. That made us curious." Ford turned his gaze toward Titan. The bull hadn't moved. Caleb stood near him now, hand resting gently on the creature's shoulder. The scene looked surreal in the storm, like something from a painting caught in motion. Ford opened a folder and pulled out the warrant Everett had handed over. "This," he said, holding it up, "is fake. Whoever made it knew the font, but got the signature wrong. Sloppy work." Everett's mouth opened, then shut. Ford nodded to Dalton. "You're going to want to cuff Mr. Shaw here and start clearing his files. I'll need everything." The sheriff hesitated only a second before moving. Everett stood frozen, soaked and stunned as the cuffs clicked shut. It was over. Ford spent another hour walking the property with Mason, taking notes, occasionally pausing to stare at Titan. When the paperwork was done, he turned to leave, but Caleb stepped forward. "He remembers," the boy said softly. Ford turned back, curious. "Remembers what?" "Pain," Caleb answered. "But he doesn't return it unless you deserve it." Ford said nothing. His brow furrowed slightly like he wanted to speak, but he didn't. He gave a nod and turned away. Mason watched the car drive off, the tail light swallowed by the darkness beyond the ridge. He turned to Caleb, still barefoot, still steady. The boy looked older somehow, not by age but by experience. Mason took his hand and held it tight as they walked back toward the porch. The storm had begun to fade. Rain still fell, but softer now. The wind slowed. The sky no longer flashed. Titan stood just beyond the porch light, unmoving, watching the horizon, breathing slow and deep. Not asleep, not restless, just present. That night, the winds died down, but Titan didn't sleep. He stood guard, just beyond the porch light, breathing slow and even, like he was watching something the rest of them couldn't see. The first visitor came just after sunrise. Mason spotted the dust trail from his porch, coffee in hand, as an old blue pickup crawled down the main road and turned into the gravel path leading toward the ranch. The tires crunched over the stones slowly like the driver wasn't sure he should be here. Mason stood, hand resting near the doorframe, his eyes narrowing slightly as the truck came to a stop near the gate. A man in his 60s stepped out, wearing a faded cap and boots too clean to belong to a rancher. He didn't wave, just walked toward the fence, paused, and peered across the field. "Is it true?" he asked softly, not looking at Mason. "The bull, is he still here?" Mason didn't answer right away. He followed the man's gaze to the wide pasture beyond the house. Titan stood in the grass, calm, his black coat gleaming in the early sun. Caleb was nearby, sketchpad in hand, sitting cross-legged beneath the old pecan tree that had survived the last drought. "He's here," Mason finally said, "but he's not on display." The man nodded once. He didn't ask for more, just stood there another minute, then tipped his cap and got back in his truck. By the end of that week, 4 more came. Some were neighbors who'd kept their distance since Mason's wife passed. Others were strangers, drawn in by rumors passed along feed store counters or whispered in cafe corners. No one ever came loud. No one tried to push past the gate. But all of them had the same questions in their eyes, the kind they were too afraid to say out loud. What was that bull? Mason didn't confirm anything, didn't deny it either. He let Titan speak for himself. The stable near the main house had been rebuilt from scratch. It stood taller than the old barn, its walls reinforced with steel plating hidden behind cedar panels. The locks were custom, but discreet, not to cage the animal, but to keep others out. A perimeter of motion lights had been added along the pasture edge. Mason had even installed a camera system, though he rarely checked the feed. Titan didn't need protecting anymore. He was the protection. A letter had come in the 2nd month, an offer from a journalist out of state. High profile, polished, and eager to buy the story. They'd offered a 5-figure sum just for an interview. Mason read it twice, folded it neatly, and burned it in the fireplace. Some stories weren't meant to be sold. Caleb had become talkative again, his words flowing like spring water. Every afternoon he sat by the pasture with his sketchbook and pencils, illustrating the story he said only he could tell. Page by page he drew Titan's journey, the wounds, the healing, the storm, and the charge, but the bull was never shown as wild. Caleb drew him with human eyes, thoughtful, calm, tired sometimes, but always present. He called the book The Bull That Waited. One afternoon, as Mason was splitting wood by the shed, he saw Caleb watching Titan again, quiet and still. The boy had stopped drawing. His hands were resting in his lap, and his face wore a distant look. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Caleb didn't look away from the pasture. "I think Titan came here for a reason," he said slowly. "Not just to be saved, but to save us." Mason said nothing at first. His breath caught in his throat. There was no argument to make, no logic to question it with, just a truth that hung there in the summer air like mist. He nodded once and went back to stacking logs. The quiet didn't last. 3 months to the day since that storm, Mason received a letter. No return address. Just his name, printed in neat block letters on the envelope. He opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of a police report. 1 page, sparse details. A truck registered to Everett Shaw had been found abandoned near the edge of Diamondback Canyon. Engine still running, door open. No sign of the driver. Search parties had canvassed the area for 2 days. No footprints, no blood, just wind, cliff edge, and silence. The official word from Sheriff Dalton was, "A likely escape attempt gone wrong." The canyon was deep and unforgiving. One misstep could mean a fall no one came back from. Mason stared at the report for a long time. He didn't speak about it, not to the sheriff, not to the neighbors, not even to Caleb. But deep in his chest, a thought sat heavy and unmoving. That night, Titan stood by the fence as the wind shifted. The bull's posture was calm, his breathing slow, but there was something in the way he looked toward the ridge, like he knew, like something had ended. After that, the tension that had lingered over the ranch began to fade. Titan stopped pacing the fence at night. He took to lying near the pecan tree where Caleb liked to draw, sometimes resting his head on the grass while the boy read aloud to him. The bull no longer flinched at loud sounds or backed away from visitors' cars. He was still watchful, but not tense, peaceful in his own quiet way. People stopped asking questions. They simply started nodding with respect when they saw Mason in town. The boy and the bull had become something more than just a strange pair. They became a story of their own, spoken about in low voices, shared like folklore. A reminder that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it listened. And sometimes it returned. The farm didn't get richer. The drought didn't vanish. But something had shifted. A feeling that things might start again. That redemption didn't always come in the way people expected, but it came. One evening, just before sundown, Mason stood on the porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He watched the field as the sky melted into amber and gold. The shadows stretched long across the grass and the light turned soft. Caleb stood near the fence, his hand resting lightly against Titan's shoulder. No rope, no halter, no commands, just trust. Mason studied the image like he might lose it if he blinked. And in that moment it became clear. He hadn't just saved a bull for his son. He'd saved his son with a bull.